It was a quiet afternoon when Allie and Sarah, two curious children, were playing in their house. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the rooms. As they ran through the house, laughing and chasing each other, Allie tripped over something hidden behind an old bookshelf in the corner of the living room. His hand brushed against the bookshelf, and to his surprise, it moved. Sarah, who was just behind him, saw the bookshelf shift and gasped. "What is that?" she whispered. Both children stared at the strange sight. The bookshelf was covering a small door, one they had never noticed before. It was old, with peeling paint and rusted hinges. Allie was the first to move. He reached out and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, sending a shiver down their spines. The air that rushed out was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. They both stepped back, unsure whether they should enter. "Should we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Allie nodded, curiosity getting the best of him. They both stepped inside. The room was dark. There was no light, and the only sound was the quiet thumping of their hearts. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they saw old furniture covered in dust. There were no windows, and the air was thick with a musty smell, as though the room had been forgotten for years. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang, making them jump. The children looked at each other, wide-eyed, feeling a sudden rush of fear. The room felt wrong. The air grew even colder, and a strange feeling washed over them as if something was watching. "Let's go back," Sarah said, her voice shaky. But when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to be alive, closing in around them. Allie and Sarah stood frozen in the dark room. The cold air seemed to wrap around them like invisible hands. "Why won't the door open?" Allie whispered, tugging on the handle. It wouldn't move, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "We're trapped," Sarah said, her voice trembling. The room felt bigger now, the walls stretching out into shadows. Sarah clutched Allie's arm tightly. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Allie listened, his breath caught in his throat. Faint whispers filled the air, like voices speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from every corner of the room. The children turned toward the far wall. A large, cracked mirror hung there. It reflected the room dimly, but something was wrong. In the reflection, there was movement, figures shifting in the darkness. Allie and Sarah weren't alone. "I don't want to be here," Sarah said, stepping closer to her brother. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, where she saw a figure standing behind them. Allie spun around, but the figure wasn't there. "What was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah pointed at the mirror. "It's in there," she said. The figure in the mirror moved closer, its face pale and twisted. Its empty eyes stared directly at them, and its mouth opened wide as if it were screaming silently. Allie grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to get out," he said. But as they tried to move, the floor seemed to shift beneath them. The wooden planks creaked loudly, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, turning into a low growl. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer and darker, reaching toward the children like creeping vines. "Don't look at the mirror," Allie warned, pulling Sarah toward the door. But she couldn't look away. The reflection of the twisted figure was now smiling. Before Allie could say another word, the lights flickered, and everything went pitch black. In the living room, Allie and Sarah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Khan, sat sipping tea when they noticed something strange. The house had become eerily quiet. The usual sound of the children playing was gone. "Where are they?" Mrs. Khan asked, setting down her cup. "They were here a moment ago, Mr. Khan replied, frowning. He stood up and began searching the house. As they looked through each room, a chilling thought crept into their minds. The house felt different. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed darker. "Mrs. Khan called out, Allie. Sarah." Her voice echoed strangely, as though the house was swallowing the sound. Then, she noticed the bookshelf in the living room. It had been moved slightly, revealing a small door they had never seen before. She froze. "Have you ever seen this door?" she asked her husband. Mr. Khan shook his head. "No, I didn't even know this existed." Without hesitation, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark and cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. "Allie, Sarah, Mr. Khan called out. The door slammed shut behind them with a force that made Mrs. Khan jump. She spun around, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers began then, soft at first, then growing louder. They were faint, like children's voices, but distorted. "Where are you, Mrs. Khan?" cried out, her voice breaking. Suddenly, they heard Sarah's scream, faint and distant. "Help us, Mr. Khan grabbed his wife's hand. "We have to find them." As they moved deeper into the room, the space seemed to shift around them. The walls stretched, the ceiling felt higher, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. Shadows danced along the edges of their vision, moving too fast to catch. Then they saw it, the cracked mirror. In its reflection, they saw their children standing in the far corner, their faces pale with fear. But something else was there too, a dark figure standing between them, its glowing eyes fixed on the parents. Mr. and Mrs. Khan froze as they stared into the cracked mirror. The reflection showed their children trembling in the corner of the room, but the shadowy figure between them made their blood run cold. Its long, bony fingers stretched toward Ali and Sarah, who were too terrified to move. "We have to get to them," Mrs. Khan whispered, her voice shaking. The parents stepped forward, but the room reacted instantly. The walls began to shift, groaning loudly as if the house itself was alive. The door they had entered from disappeared, replaced by an endless wall of darkness. "Stay together, Mr. Khan said firmly, gripping his wife's hand. As they moved toward the corner where the children were, the floorboards creaked and splintered beneath their feet. With each step, the whispers grew louder, turning into faint, mocking laughter. Shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, reaching out like clawed hands. "Ali, Sarah, Mrs. Khan called out. Her voice seemed to awaken something in the room. The dark figure in the mirror turned its head toward the parents. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the air. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the parents felt an invisible force pushing them back. Mr. Khan gritted his teeth and fought against it, pulling Mrs. Khan forward. "We're not leaving without them," he yelled. As they reached the children, the figure stepped out of the mirror. Its form was unclear, as if it were made of smoke and shadows, but its presence was suffocating. It let out a terrible screech, and the walls of the room began to close in. Mrs. Khan grabbed Sarah, while Mr. Khan pulled Ali into his arms. "Run," he shouted. But the room wouldn't let them escape. The shadows wrapped around their legs, dragging them back toward the mirror. The figure raised its hand, and the laughter turned into a deafening roar. In the chaos, Ali cried out, "It won't let us leave." The parents could feel the room pulling them deeper into its darkness. Their strength was fading, but they refused to let go of their children. The dark figure loomed over them, its hollow eyes glowing like burning coals. Shadows swirled around its body, reaching out to pull the family deeper into the room. Ali and Sarah clung tightly to their parents, their terrified cries echoing in the air. Mrs. Khan's voice broke through the chaos. "We won't let it take them," she screamed, clutching Sarah as if her life depended on it. Mr. Khan spotted the cracked mirror behind the figure. His instincts told him it was the key. "The mirror," he shouted. "It's controlling everything." The figure let out an ear-piercing screech, as if it understood their plan. The shadows grew stronger, clawing at their arms and legs, dragging them toward the center of the room. The parents fought with all their strength, refusing to let go of their children. With a surge of determination, Mr. Khan grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor. "Hold on," he yelled, charging toward the mirror. The room seemed to resist him. The floorboards cracked, and the air felt heavy, like he was moving through water. The figure turned, its clawed hand reaching for him, but he swung the chair leg with all his might. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash. For a moment, everything went silent. The shadows froze, and the figure let out a deep, guttural roar as its form began to dissolve into smoke. The room trembled violently, and the walls started to crack. "We have to get out," Mrs. Khan screamed, pulling Ali and Sarah toward the now visible door. The family ran as the room collapsed around them. The whispers turned into agonized screams, and the dark figure disappeared into nothingness. They burst through the door just as it slammed shut behind them. Breathing heavily, the family stood in the living room, the air now warm and still. The hidden door had vanished, as if it had never existed. But as they hugged each other tightly, they heard a faint whisper from the shadows, "You can't escape me forever." Asterisk.